Some secrets burn not in darkness, but in the quiet glow of a single candle. This tale begins on a frost-bound December morning, where a young woman's fearful plea draws Holmes and Watson into a manor steeped in silence, deceit, and a Christmas Eve death foretold. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us follow the flicker of that fatal light, and see where its flame shall lead. It was upon a bitter morning in December that I found myself once more at Baker Street, the familiar chambers wrapped in that peculiar silence which London only knows when a heavy fall of snow has smothered its unrest. The lamps still glowed faintly in the half-light, their orange haze casting a mournful glow upon the frozen pavements. A pall of smoke from countless chimneys hung low over the city, mingling with the mist so that the very air seemed to press heavily upon one's lungs. The cries of the costermongers had ceased, the wheels of cabs were muffled, and the whole metropolis lay subdued beneath a white shroud. I remember how the flakes had clung to the black railings, to the ledges of the windows, and to the outstretched branches of the plane trees, lending even Baker Street, usually so bustling, a look of forlorn tranquillity. Within, however, the cheerful crackle of coal and the glow of the hearth offered a welcome reprieve from the desolation without, though I could not help but feel that the season's gaiety had been curiously hushed by the severity of the frost. Holmes was seated in his armchair, his long, lean figure outlined against the blaze. He had sunk into that rare state of quiescence when his restless intellect, finding no case to engage it, brooded in silence over the grey embers of his thoughts. His hands, steepled beneath his chin, betrayed no tremor, yet I knew the attitude well enough to recognize it as a deceptive repose. The violin lay idle upon the side table, while his chemical apparatus, usually arranged in such meticulous order, stood neglected. He stirred only once, when a faint sound arose from the street below. With a slight turn of the head, Holmes's sharp profile caught the glow of the fire, and I observed the sudden brightening of his eyes. "Watson," said he, almost absently, "do you perceive how the silence is broken? There is expectancy in it." I went to the window, but saw only the blurred outlines of passers-by in the drifting mist. Yet my companion's attention did not waver. Something beyond my duller faculties had already signalled to him the approach of a matter which would soon rouse him from his languor. Presently, the muffled thud of hooves upon snow reached our ears, and a solitary brougham emerged ghost-like from the whitened fog. It drew up with an abruptness before our door that spoke more of urgency than of ceremony. The driver, stooped low against the cold, wasted no time in alighting his passenger. Holmes, who had risen and now stood with his hands behind, his back gave a small nod, as if a private theory had been confirmed. "A hurried visit in such weather, Watson," he remarked, "is eloquent enough without a syllable spoken. We shall shortly have our caller, and you may expect that her business is of the gravest import." His words had scarce left him when there came a rap upon the knocker, sharp and hurried, reverberating through the stairwell. I confess that, though long accustomed to Holmes's anticipations, I could not wholly repress a thrill of curiosity at the precision with which he read the intentions of one who had not yet crossed our threshold. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young lady, whose appearance bore at once the marks of haste and anxiety. Her cloak, powdered with snow, was drawn tightly about her, but could not conceal the pallor of her cheeks or the tremor of her gloved hands. She advanced uncertainly, casting a nervous glance around the sitting room until her eyes rested upon Holmes. He bowed gravely, indicating the armchair opposite his own, while I, struck by the contrast between her evident distress and the festive season so near at hand, felt a surge of compassion. The holly sprigs which I had placed upon the mantel only yesterday seemed a mockery beside her wan features. She seated herself with difficulty, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came at first. Holmes, ever considerate to those overwrought by emotion, refrained from pressing her, merely observing with that calm, penetrating gaze which had unsettled so many before her. At length, she found voice enough to murmur her thanks for our indulgence, though her tone betrayed the depth of her unease. With a visible effort she composed herself, and her narrative, though halting, soon unfolded. Her name, she told us, was Miss Eleanor Ward, and she had come on behalf of her uncle, Mr. Jonathan Chesterton of Surrey. The gentleman, she explained, had of late been confined to his bed, suffering from an illness which the physicians could neither clearly diagnose nor alleviate. Yet it was not his malady alone that weighed upon her, but the singular atmosphere which had settled upon the household. Servants moved in whispers, the members of the family avoided one another's gaze, and there hung about the corridors a sense of expectancy, as though all awaited some untimely calamity. Her uncle himself had grown restless, his eyes ever fixed upon the shadows that lengthened with the early dusk, and though he spoke little, she felt convinced that he laboured under some secret dread. Her voice faltered as she confessed that it was less the prospect of his death than the unseen menace which surrounded it that had driven her to seek my companion's counsel. Holmes inclined his head gently, his keen eyes never leaving her face. "You travelled from Surrey this morning, and alone," he said, in that quiet tone which carried more conviction than any oath. She started, her gloved fingers tightening upon her reticule. "How could you possibly—" she began, then stopped, abashed. Holmes permitted himself the faintest of smiles. "Your cloak hem is marred with the chalky soil of the southern line. The snow upon your bonnet has not melted, which tells me you have come directly from the carriage without pause, and there is no trace of a companion's presence, either in your speech or manner. The conclusion, therefore, is obvious." Miss Ward regarded him with mingled awe and apprehension, as though his very glance might lay bare her innermost secrets. Yet the effect, far from alienating her, seemed to lift a burden, for she leaned forward slightly, as if eager to entrust herself to one who could perceive so much from so little. I watched the transformation with admiration, knowing how often Holmes's precision, however disconcerting, became the very key to a client's confidence. At last she pressed her handkerchief to her lips and uttered the fear which had haunted her, that her uncle, though still alive, would not survive to witness Christmas Eve. She declared that this belief had taken hold of her with such force that even the assurances of physicians could not shake it. Something unseen, she insisted, was preying upon him, hastening his decline beyond the reach of natural illness. Her words hung heavily in the room, their chill matching the frost outside, until Holmes broke the silence. "You have done wisely, Miss Ward, to come," said he gravely. "The matter shall have my full attention." Her eyes shone with relief, though her lips still trembled. As she rose to depart, I noted that the burden of fear still clung to her, as though no human promise could wholly banish it. Yet there was a resoluteness in Holmes's manner which told me that for him the game had already begun. The following morning found Holmes and myself upon the early train, bound southward towards Surrey. The season's severity had not abated. The fields that stretched from the carriage window were spread in a blanket of white, broken only by the dark hedgerows and the spectral forms of leafless oaks. The countryside, usually so alive with rustic industry, seemed paralysed beneath the frost. The smoke of farmsteads rose reluctantly, hanging low and unmoving in the still air. My companion sat opposite me, his long frame drawn close, his sharp features composed in an expression of contemplative reserve. He scarcely stirred save to draw upon his pipe, the faint bluish cloud wreathing about him in a manner oddly suggestive of his inward speculations. The only sound to break the quiet of our compartment was the measured rhythm of the wheels upon the frozen rails. I ventured once or twice to speak of Miss Ward's singular apprehensions, but Holmes, raising his hand, would only murmur, "The facts, Watson, the facts. The rest will follow." Thus we passed the journey, I in half-suppressed curiosity, he in that austere silence which bespoke a mind already shaping its theory. By noon, we had descended at a modest country station, where a dog-cart awaited to convey us along the frozen lanes. The horse's breath steamed in the air, and the iron shoes rang sharply against the hardened road. Presently, rounding a turn, the house itself came into view, A broad-fronted Georgian manor of red brick, its roof crowned with snow, and its tall chimneys issuing thin columns of smoke. The windows had been decked with wreaths of holly and fir, their red berries glowing faintly against the frost. Yet there was in the very aspect of the place something that jarred against these festive adornments. A gloom hung over its gables, as though the house, despite its cheerful dress, stood conscious of some hidden affliction within. Holmes surveyed it with narrowed eyes, his gaze resting long upon the upper windows. "A house of two faces," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I could not but feel, as we drew up before the great door, that our reception would be less welcoming than the garlands suggested. Our knock was answered promptly by a young gentleman, who introduced himself as Mr. Charles Chesterton, the nephew of the invalid master. His manner, though outwardly polite, bore the stamp of constraint. There was in his eye no warmth of gratitude towards those who had come at his cousin's urgent appeal, but rather a suspicion thinly veiled by civility. He led us into the porch with perfunctory courtesies, speaking of the severity of the weather, though his words were cold, and his glance shifted nervously from Holmes to myself. I recalled the tremulous earnestness of Miss Ward, and the contrast struck me forcibly. Here was no anxious relative eager for aid, but a young man ill at ease with our presence. Holmes bowed in silence, his scrutiny passing over the features of our host, as though he would register each flicker of expression. I could see that my companion's mind was already recording these impressions, while I, less acute, felt only the vague disquiet of one received with courtesy that did not spring from the heart. We were ushered into the hall, a wide chamber whose oak panelling was strung with garlands and whose stone floor gleamed with recent polishing. Yet the attempt at festivity rang hollow, for the air of the place seemed hushed, as though laughter had long been a stranger there. The housekeeper, a woman of middle years, with a lined face and careful step, emerged from a side passage, her hands occupied with the arrangement of evergreens. At sight of Holmes, her movements faltered, and she stood as one momentarily disconcerted. Recovering herself, she offered a word of welcome, but her eyes betrayed a nervous flutter, darting from the staircase to the visitor's keen face. Holmes, in his most courteous manner, addressed her upon the season's preparations, and as she replied, he bent his gaze upon the decorations she carried. I noted how her hands trembled as she fastened them, and how her lips pressed tightly upon words that seemed almost to escape. "A housekeeper who knows more than she dares tell," Holmes whispered to me when she had passed on, leaving in her wake an impression of long-guarded secrets and unspoken apprehensions. We had scarce settled ourselves in the withdrawing room when a knock resounded at the door, and a clergyman was announced. The Reverend Mr. Collier, a spare figure with solemn eyes, entered with an air of pious concern. He professed himself anxious for the health of Mr. Chesterton, whom he described as a valued parishioner, and he inquired with a courtesy that struck me as curiously eager whether the physicians had spoken of improvement. His words were well chosen, yet I perceived a certain tension in his glance, as though his interest extended beyond the soul to the household itself. Holmes, who had risen and bowed gravely, listened with that impassivity which veiled the most minute observation. "Your solicitude does you credit," said he, "though I trust your parish affords you many cares besides this one family." The remark brought a faint flush to the clergyman's cheek, and he took his leave after a few further words, though not before his eyes had travelled once more towards the staircase with an intentness that I did not fail to remark. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the mantel as the door closed behind him. The remainder of the afternoon we spent in quiet observation of the household. Though the servants moved busily, stringing ivy along the banisters and polishing the silver, there was in their conduct a reserve, as if gaiety were forbidden ground. The members of the family, too, exchanged but curt remarks, and more than once I surprised furtive glances laden with unease. Holmes and I withdrew to a recess of the hall, from which we might observe unseen. "Note, Watson," whispered he, "how the merriment is strained. Here we see not a family preparing for Christmas, but conspirators cloaked in tinsel. Indeed, the clash between outward festivity and inward discord was so palpable that it chilled me more than the air without. Even the crackling of the great Yule log upon the hearth could not dispel the impression that these halls were haunted, not by spectres, but by secrets which pressed heavily upon all who dwelt within. As the winter evening closed in and the shadows deepened about the mullioned windows, Holmes drew me aside into the library. The hush of the place was broken only by the ticking of a tall clock and the faint rustle of pages as my companion turned over a volume lying upon the table. At length he spoke. "Watson, every soul beneath this roof carries some burden of concealment. The nephew, guarded in his courtesy. The housekeeper, betraying guilt in every tremor. The clergyman, whose interest in the worldly is cloaked beneath the spiritual. It is as though the shadow of Chesterton's illness has cast suspicion upon them all." I could only assent, for my own perceptions, though less keenly gathered, confirmed the impression. Holmes's gaze fixed upon the fire, his features stern in the flickering glow. "Mark me well," said he softly. "Beneath this veneer of Christmas cheer there lies a struggle of motives, and at its centre the failing master upstairs. The hour is near when truth must come to light, though its path be through darkness." The hours of evening descended upon Chesterton House with a solemnity which no fire nor festive decoration could relieve. Though the holly wreaths still clung bravely to the window panes, their scarlet berries seemed but gaudy trifles set against the pervasive hush of dread that filled the corridors. Servants moved softly, as if fearful that the very echo of their steps might hasten the master's decline. From beyond the closed doors of the sick-room there came no sound save the occasional creak of timbers and the muffled sigh of the wind pressing against the shutters. Holmes and I remained in the withdrawing room, where the flicker of the candles threw long shadows across the panelled walls, lending the impression of half-seen figures gliding silently past. The usual cheer of the season was absent. No carol, no merry voice intruded upon the silence. I confess that I felt an oppression, as though the house itself lay waiting for some catastrophe already on the wing. Holmes, though outwardly composed, had about him that taut stillness which I had learned to associate with the sharpening of his faculties. At last, we were summoned by the housekeeper to the chamber of the invalid. The atmosphere struck me at once. A close, heavy odour of drugs mingled with the faint scent of spent candle wax, clinging to the hangings and the very air itself. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, and upon the bed lay the figure of Mr. Chesterton, wasted by illness to a mere shadow of his former self. His sunken eyes flickered with a restless light, and his breath came in shallow gasps that seemed each moment to falter upon the brink of extinction. Holmes bent over him, silent and intent, his gaze travelling from the trembling hands upon the coverlet to the small table by the bedside, where a half-burnt candle stood in its brass stick. I observed how he lingered upon it with that peculiar fixity which marked the birth of a suspicion in his mind. The physician in me could not but lament the hopeless state of the patient, yet I knew by Holmes's expression that he perceived in this chamber something beyond the reach of medicine. We had scarcely withdrawn to the threshold when a faint stirring from the bed arrested us. Mr. Chesterton's lips moved, and in a voice scarcely more than a whisper, he shaped a phrase which caused us both to lean forward, lest the sound be lost. "The candle, before Christmas Eve," he murmured, the words issuing brokenly, yet with such intensity that one could not doubt their import. A silence followed, broken only by the faint tread of a servant crossing the hall outside. The invalid sank back, his breath once more shallow and irregular, while a look of piteous terror clouded his wasted features. I glanced at Holmes, but his face betrayed nothing, save that inward tension I had come to recognize. The phrase itself, so strange in its framing, seemed but another of those half-delirious utterances common to the dying. Yet even in that moment I could not dispel a shiver, for there was in his tone something more deliberate, as though he strove to deliver a message of utmost urgency. The household did not fail to remark upon the words, In the withdrawing room, shortly after, the family gathered in subdued debate. Miss Ward sat pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly upon her lap, as though in confirmation of her worst fears. The nephew, Mr. Charles, affected a brusque indifference, dismissing the utterance as the wanderings of a mind unhinged by illness. Yet his eyes betrayed an impatience that ill accorded with his words. The housekeeper, with trembling lips, muttered something of omens and warnings, while the clergyman, who had returned unbidden, sought to invest the phrase with pious meaning, speaking of light extinguished before its appointed hour. Holmes listened to them all in quiet reserve, his gaze wandering from face to face, marking each subtle variation of response. I, for my part, felt the oppressive weight of their divisions. It seemed to me that the very bonds of kinship were frayed, and that the old man's cryptic phrase had but torn aside the veil that covered their mutual mistrust. The house had scarcely settled into the uneasy stillness of night when calamity fell. It was yet some hours before dawn when the sound of hurried feet and a low cry reached my ears. I hastened with Holmes to the sick room, where the physician in attendance met us with solemn face. Mr. Chesterton had breathed his last. No spasm, no convulsion marked his end. He had slipped quietly into death as though some invisible hand had pressed upon the feeble flame of life and quenched it. Yet the swiftness of his departure, so soon after his strange utterance, left the household shaken. Whispers of foul play stole through the servants, and even among the family there were glances that spoke more loudly than words. Miss Ward, I saw, wept silently, while her cousin stood rigid, his jaw set, as though calculation, not grief, occupied his thoughts. Holmes alone remained unmoved, his keen eyes darting from the extinguished candle to the still form upon the bed. While the others withdrew in confusion, Holmes lingered in the chamber, his expression one of austere attention. He drew the lamp closer and bent above the table, examining the candle with that patient scrutiny which no detail escaped. His fingers traced lightly along the window latch, where a faint mark upon the wood caught his eye, though he offered no comment. I observed, too, how he stooped to the carpet, where his gaze rested upon some impression too slight for my unpractised sight. The silence of the room was broken only by the faint hiss of the lamp and the subdued rustle of Holmes's movements. I longed to inquire into his thoughts, but his countenance forbade intrusion. At length he straightened, his face set in grave composure, and extinguished the lamp with a decisive motion. We passed out together, leaving the chamber cloaked once more in shadow, and I felt the weight of unsolved mystery pressing upon us both. In the solitude of the library, with the embers of the fire casting a dull glow, Holmes seated himself and drew his long fingers together. For some minutes he remained thus, his eyes fixed upon the hearth, as though reading in its ashes the secret that had eluded the rest of us. At length he spoke, more to himself than to me. The words were no wandering fancy, Watson. They were the deliberate testament of a man who saw death approach and sought to name its instrument. The candle before Christmas Eve. It is there that we must seek the key. His voice fell again into silence, and he leaned back, his features half in shadow. I could not but feel the chill of his certainty, for though I did not comprehend its meaning, I knew by the gravity of his tone that he had seized upon a thread which might unravel the whole. Thus the night closed, heavy with the knowledge of death, and with the darker certainty that its mystery was yet unsolved. The dawn that followed Mr. Chesterton's passing broke pale and reluctant, as though the sun itself shrank from shedding light upon the house of mourning. A grey pall lay upon the sky, and the stillness of snow over the grounds seemed to weigh upon every heart within. The servants moved about in subdued fashion, their whispers cut short at the sound of a footstep, while the members of the household avoided one another's gaze, each cloaked in his or her private disquiet. Miss Eleanor Ward, her eyes shadowed by a night without rest, moved silently through the corridors like a figure in a troubled dream. For myself, I felt an oppressive gloom, for the suddenness of the death and the strange words that had preceded it gave the air of calamity to an event that might otherwise have been ascribed to natural causes. Holmes alone appeared untouched by the universal unease. His keen gaze swept the house and its inhabitants with the same austere detachment I had observed upon many a case. And when at last he beckoned me to follow him outdoors, I knew that he had fixed already upon the path of investigation. The snow, which had fallen steadily through the night, now lay crisp and unbroken across the lawns and along the hedges. Holmes, drawing his Inverness more closely about him, remarked that the whitened ground furnished a page upon which even the clumsiest pen leaves its story. His eyes ranged swiftly over the expanse, and without hesitation, he struck a path toward the rear of the house, where the sick-room window overlooked the garden. I followed in silence, my breath clouding in the bitter air, while the crunch of our steps seemed unnaturally loud against the prevailing hush. Presently he halted, and with a gesture bade me observe the ground. I saw at once that the smooth surface of snow had been broken in several places by the marks of feet. To my eye they appeared haphazard, but Holmes bent low, his sharp features intent upon the impressions, as though they contained a cipher of profound importance. The wind, mercifully still, had preserved the outlines with surprising clarity. We traced the indentations slowly, Holmes pausing often to measure distances with his stick. The prints led directly from a clump of shrubs toward the wall beneath the chamber window, but what caught my notice was the irregularity of their spacing. At times they lay close together, as though the walker had paused. At others, they were set at strange intervals, as though the figure had leapt or faltered. Twice the marks vanished altogether for a pace or two, before reappearing in the same direction. "Curious," I muttered, my breath steaming. "A man uncertain of his purpose, perhaps." Holmes made no reply, but his eyes glittered with suppressed animation. The trail ended abruptly at the very wall of the house, directly beneath the window where the old man had lain. Holmes stood for some time regarding it in silence, then cast his glance upward to the sill, where a faint rim of frost still clung. The mystery of those halting, broken steps pressed heavily upon my imagination, filling me with a sense of dread at what their meaning might portend. Holmes signalled for me to stand aside, then mounted a narrow stone ledge to examine the window more closely. He ran his gloved hand along the sash, pausing at the latch which hung loosely, as though forced. "Observe, Watson," said he quietly. "This fastening has been tampered with from without." I craned forward to see, noting the splinter upon the wood and the slight warping of the metal catch. Yet when Holmes pressed the window gently inward, it did not yield. The frost, undisturbed upon the sill, lay thick and unbroken. "If an intruder entered here," I remarked, "he left no mark of passage." Holmes descended without comment, brushing the snow from his coat. His brows were drawn, and I could perceive that the contradiction troubled even him. For myself, the sight of that broken fastening, so plainly suggestive of intrusion, coupled with the untouched snow, set my thoughts adrift upon a tide of perplexity. We continued our circuit along the wall, where the trail resumed in strange disorder. The prints doubled back upon themselves in places, as though the maker had turned uncertainly, and here and there 2 sets overlapped, giving the impression of hesitation or even performance. I could make little sense of them, and at last confessed my bewilderment. Holmes regarded me with the faintest smile, but made no attempt to enlighten me. "There is a logic here, Watson," he murmured, "but it is one not easily perceived." The effect upon my mind was the reverse of reassurance, for if even Holmes spoke so cautiously, the matter must conceal depths of singular darkness. My imagination pictured a prowler creeping round the house in the dead of night, pausing, doubling back, as though haunted by his own purpose, a vision that filled me with a chill not wholly owing to the winter air. At length, Holmes halted where a particularly distinct impression had been preserved. He drew from his pocket a small lens and bent over it with intense scrutiny. "Note, Watson," said he, "the sole pattern. It is unlike that of any servant we have observed, nor does it match the boots of the nephew." I knelt beside him, perceiving indeed a curious cross-hatch design, foreign to the plain hobnails and heels with which I was acquainted. My heart quickened at the discovery, for here at last was tangible proof of some alien presence. Yet Holmes, straightening, merely brushed the snow from his knees and resumed his examination without a word of triumph. It was his way to hold conclusions in reserve until the entire chain lay in his grasp. For my part, I felt that this unfamiliar shoe might prove the very thread to lead us out of the labyrinth. We made our way back toward the house, the snow crunching beneath our feet. I could scarcely restrain my impatience. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, "we have evidence enough of some nocturnal visitor. What else could explain these contradictions?" He paused upon the threshold and fixed me with that penetrating gaze which seemed to read my very thoughts. "Evidence, yes," he said softly. "Explanation, not yet. The snow tells one story, the window another, and both point as much within as without. It is this, Watson, which gives me pause." With that, he entered the house, leaving me more unsettled than before. For if the trail led inward as well as outward, then what did it imply of those who dwelt beneath that roof? The chill of the winter air clung to me long after the door had closed, and I felt as though the shadow of the night's mystery had but deepened in the light of day. It was upon the morning following our fruitless exploration of the grounds that the tranquillity of Chesterton House was disturbed by the arrival of a stranger. A dog-cart drew up at the gates, and from it descended a man of middle years, fashionably attired, who bore himself with a confidence that appeared just a shade too practised. He announced himself as Mr. Henry Ward, a cousin of the family, professing that the season and his concern for his ailing relative had drawn him from a distant county to share their Christmas vigil. His words were gracious, his bow low, yet there lingered in his manner a note of performance, as though each gesture had been rehearsed before a mirror. The household, though evidently surprised, received him with a politeness that did not wholly conceal their unease. To Eleanor his presence brought no relief, for I marked how her brow clouded even as she greeted him, while the nephew's glance, sharp and questioning, betrayed both recognition and suspicion. There was, from the first, an air of dissonance between his courteous protestations and the mood of the house he had entered. Holmes, standing somewhat apart, regarded the newcomer with that expression of polite detachment which cloaked the swiftest play of his mind. He listened gravely to Mr. Ward's narrative of kinship, yet I observed how his eyes rested upon the man's cuffs, upon the faint line where travel stains should have marred but did not, and upon the careful modulation of his speech, which carried no trace of the provincial accent his story implied. When pressed as to the exact branch of the family to which he belonged, the visitor faltered, then recovered with a facility that only heightened my companion's scrutiny. The others, untrained in such matters, seemed relieved to accept his account, but Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair, a signal I had long associated with his perception of contradiction. I marvelled, as I often had, at the composure with which he dissembled his conclusions, permitting the mask of cordiality to remain while he filed away each inconsistency for the reckoning to come. In the hours that followed, the house busied itself with the outward forms of Christmas preparation, as though habit could compel cheerfulness where none existed. The maids strung ivy along the banisters, a boy from the village was engaged to sing carols at the door, and the dining room rang with the clatter of silverware as the table was laid for a modest gathering. Yet beneath these sounds of festivity, there ran a current of discord. The laughter of the nephew came too loud, as if forced. The housekeeper muttered prayers beneath her breath as she hung the greenery. And Miss Eleanor, though she moved dutifully from task to task, carried in her eyes a shadow that not even candlelight could banish. Holmes and I observed from a corner, and I could not but feel that the mirth was but a brittle crust over some darker ferment, ready to crack at the least pressure. The stranger moved among them with practiced ease, offering compliments and lending his hand to the decorations, yet his smile struck me as too ready, and his eyes lingered too long upon every whispered aside. It was in the midst of these preparations that a curious incident occurred. 2 parcels were delivered to the hall by a servant. One, a heavy box sealed with wax, addressed to the household in general. The other, a smaller packet, lacking any name of sender. The first, when shaken, gave forth a dull metallic sound, and speculation arose at once as to its contents, though none professed to expect it. The second, wrapped in plain brown paper, seemed still more enigmatic, for its very anonymity lent it an air of menace. The family gathered round with strained curiosity, their whispers filling the air with conjecture. Holmes alone remained aloof, his eyes half closed, as though listening less to their words than to the undertone of suspicion which accompanied them. The parcels were set aside unopened to await a more fitting moment, but I observed that both Miss Eleanor and the housekeeper looked upon them with a nervousness out of proportion to their simplicity. It seemed to me that these so-called gifts had brought not cheer, but a deepened unease. Later, as dusk fell and the lamps were lit, the stranger drew near to the hearth where Holmes sat, and began to enlarge upon his supposed ancestry. He spoke of youthful visits to Chesterton House, of family ties long neglected, of duties now revived by compassion. Yet in the weaving of his tale, he stumbled upon small details, which Holmes, with the gentlest of interjections, laid bare. "You recall the library, sir, with its portraits?" Holmes observed. "Surely the likeness of Sir Geoffrey Chesterton remains vivid in your memory." The man hesitated, then corrected himself clumsily. Again Holmes pressed him upon dates and kinship, and each question, so politely framed, seemed to unravel a thread from the fabric of his story. Presently, the colour rose in the man's cheeks, and his fingers played restlessly with the watch chain at his waist. He sought to laugh away the contradictions, but the laugh rang hollow. I, who had listened at first with credulity, now felt the chill of doubt creep upon me. When at last the conversation drifted to other topics, I withdrew with Holmes to a quiet corner, my mind a tumult of questions. "Surely," I whispered, "we have unmasked an impostor. His tale is full of holes. Why not confront him outright?" Holmes only shook his head, his eyes fixed upon the company. "There is more to be learned in silence, Watson, than in accusation," he murmured, and lapsed into that infuriating stillness which cloaked his reasoning. The family meanwhile conversed in low tones, some seeking to extend courtesy to the guest, others plainly disquieted by his presence. I could not determine where truth ended and deception began, for each gesture seemed capable of 2 interpretations. My own uncertainty deepened until I longed for Holmes to break his silence. Yet he sat unmoved, his gaze half veiled, allowing the contradictions to ferment until the very air seemed thick with suspicion. The evening closed with the family dispersing to their chambers, the parcels still unopened upon the side table, the holly wreaths drooping slightly in the heat of the fire. As Holmes and I mounted the stairs, I ventured once more to press him. He paused, his hand upon the balustrade, and turned to me with that grave composure which boded the approach of some revelation. "Watson," said he, "this visitor did not stumble upon Chesterton House by chance, nor does his tale bear the weight of truth. His object lies yet concealed, but be assured that it touches the very heart of the matter. We have seen but the surface. The depth is still to come." With that he bade me good night, leaving me to ponder his words in the stillness of my chamber. Long did I lie awake, listening to the sigh of the wind along the eaves, and wondering what secret purpose had drawn the stranger to a house already darkened by death. It was upon the morning after the stranger's disquieting arrival that Holmes proposed another visit to the chamber of the deceased. The pretext was simple enough, a desire to observe whether any overlooked matter might lend itself to explanation, yet I could not mistake the keenness with which he ascended the stair. The room, when we entered it, bore that solemn hush which death impresses upon its surroundings. The curtains hung heavy, the air close, and the still form upon the bed seemed already half withdrawn from earthly presence. The faintest draught moved the bed hangings, stirring them like phantoms. I confess that the stillness weighed upon me, and I was glad of Holmes's quiet authority as he moved without hesitation to the small table at the bedside. It was as though the hour had never advanced. The very candle, stunted by its last burning, yet remained upon the stand, mute witness to those final moments. Holmes bent low, and I perceived that his attention was fixed with an intensity not often visible even in him. He drew the candlestick toward him, turning it this way and that, his keen eyes travelling over its every detail. To me it appeared but an ordinary household article, the brass dulled by age, the wax guttered into irregular ridges. Yet Holmes's nostrils flared slightly, as though he had detected some unfamiliar odour. "You observe, Watson," said he softly, "this residue, not the simple fat of common wax, but a trace of something more acrid." I bent to it, but could discern no more than the faint grease upon my fingers and a suggestion of bitterness in the air. "A trick of the imagination," I muttered, though my words lacked conviction. Holmes smiled faintly, his long, delicate fingers holding the stub as though it were a clue more eloquent than a volume of testimony. "Candles," he murmured, "serve not only to illuminate, but to conceal." The phrase, enigmatic to me, was uttered with such composure that I felt at once that some thread, hitherto invisible, had revealed itself to his trained perception. Holmes requested that a bell jar from the conservatory be fetched, and in short order we stood before a makeshift arrangement upon a tray. The candle, cut and reset, was lit within the glass dome. For some moments it burned with a steady flame, its light refracted strangely through the curve of glass. Then I remarked a faint discoloration in the air and felt upon my throat an oppression, as though the atmosphere thickened with unseen vapours. My temples throbbed, and a sense of dizziness overcame me, so that I stepped back with an exclamation. Holmes at once smothered the flame, and the oppressive sensation lifted. "You perceive it, Watson?" said he, his eyes alight. "Not smoke, nor the common effluvia of wax, but an exhalation of subtle and insidious kind. Enough to sap vitality, imperceptibly at first, yet fatally if endured." I drew a deep breath of the clearer air, conscious of the sinister revelation that such a trivial object could harbour a menace so profound. Holmes set the candlestick down with a deliberation that seemed almost reverent. "Here lies the instrument of death," said he, "a weapon as silent as it is sure. This candle has been impregnated with a chemical preparation, one that volatilizes in the heat of its own flame. No blade, no bullet, Watson, but a slow vapour insinuating itself into the lungs until nature falters." He paced the chamber as he spoke, his long fingers interlaced behind him. "The brilliance lies in its very simplicity. What more innocent than a candle beside a sick man's bed? Who would suspect that the light by which he reads or prays is at the same instant consuming his life?" I shuddered at the thought, for there was in it a cruelty beyond the common run of crimes, a corruption of the very emblem of comfort and peace. Holmes's voice, though calm, carried a weight that impressed upon me the gravity of what he had uncovered. It was then that the strange utterance of the old man recurred to me with sudden force. "The candle before Christmas Eve," I murmured aloud. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Precisely, Watson. Not the ramblings of delirium, but the desperate warning of a mind that grasped, even in extremity, the source of its undoing. He knew, or at least suspected, that the very flame at his side was his enemy. Lacking strength for more, he named it as best he could. The poignancy of the scene returned to me. The wasted figure, the whisper scarcely audible, the look of mortal fear, and I felt a chill at the realization that his last effort had been to deliver into our hands the clue to his own destruction. Yet even in that revelation there lingered ambiguity, for the words, so plain now, had not saved him. Holmes replaced the candlestick upon the table and turned towards the door. "The method is clear," said he, "but the hand that contrived it remains in shadow. Consider, Watson, such tampering could not be wrought by a stranger at hazard. It required access, leisure, and knowledge of the chamber. Our suspicions, therefore, must turn inward, upon those who cross this threshold freely." I recalled the faces of the household, the guarded nephew, the trembling housekeeper, the clergyman with his unwarranted interest, and the newly arrived kinsman whose tale rang false. Each, in his or her degree, had opportunity. Which among them bore the heart to employ such diabolical means? I could frame no answer, but the thought chilled me the more for its uncertainty. Holmes's eyes, sharp and penetrating, seemed to pierce through the very walls as though he would summon the truth forth from its hiding. That night, as I sat with Holmes before the fire, I found myself haunted by the sinister discovery. It was no longer a question of vague fears or whispered omens, but of a fact dreadful in its certainty. A candle, so commonplace, so harmless to the eye, had been made an assassin. In its flame had lurked a doom swifter and surer than disease, stealing life beneath the semblance of comfort. I confess that I looked askance even at the honest tapers upon the mantel, as though in every flicker lay some menace unsuspected. Holmes, sunk deep in thought, spoke little, his gaze fixed upon the dancing light, as though challenging it to betray its secret. For myself, I could not escape the irony. That man, who fashions candles to banish darkness, might also shape them into instruments of death. And in that irony lay a dread that clung to me long after the flame had burned low. It was upon the eve of Christmas that Holmes, having completed his quiet inquiries, required that the entire household assemble in the drawing-room. The summons was obeyed with visible reluctance, for the shadow of death still lingered in the corridors, and festivity had been reduced to little more than a pretense. Yet, as the clock struck 7, we found ourselves gathered about the long chamber, its walls lined with dark portraits that seemed, in the flicker of the flames, to watch us with sombre interest. A great fire blazed upon the hearth, casting a ruddy glow, while upon the mantel-shelf and tables stood candles, their flames wavering faintly in the draught. To my mind, the sight of those lights, so innocent in themselves, recalled with grim irony the dreadful instrument Holmes had unmasked but a day before. The faces of the company were set and uneasy, Miss Eleanor pale and trembling, the housekeeper furtive and nervous, the clergyman stiff with outward propriety, and the newly arrived kinsman seated with too much ease. The nephew, Charles, shifted continually in his chair, his lips compressed, his gaze roving restlessly from one to another. Into this heavy air Holmes entered with his habitual composure, his figure outlined sharply against the firelight, his eyes cold and brilliant. When the murmurs had subsided, Holmes rose and stood before the hearth. His voice, calm yet carrying to every corner of the room, cut through the silence like steel. He began by recalling the circumstances of Mr. Chesterton's decline, the mysterious utterance that had preceded his death, the suddenness of his passing, and the confusion into which the family had fallen. He spoke next of the candle, the commonplace object which concealed within it the very mechanism of murder. It was no phantom, no caprice of nature, he said, but the deliberate contrivance of a calculating mind. The candle, impregnated with a noxious preparation, became the silent assassin, exhaling death beneath the guise of light. A shudder passed visibly among those present, and I observed how the flame of one taper guttered in the draught, as though in guilty sympathy. Holmes's gaze swept the company. The question remains, who placed it there, and for what end? His words hung in the air, each syllable weighted with accusation, and no man or woman dared meet his eye. Holmes allowed the silence to deepen until it pressed like a physical burden upon us all. Then, with deliberate composure, he turned towards Charles Chesterton. "You, sir, were in and out of the sick room on the evening preceding your uncle's death. Pray, inform us of your movements between the hours of 9 and 11. The young man started, his face paling beneath its forced composure. He launched into an explanation of sitting with the clergyman over accounts, of consulting with the housekeeper concerning arrangements, and of retiring early to his chamber. Yet as Holmes pressed him with questions, at what precise moment he left the study, at which hour he ascended the stairs, who could vouch for his presence, the tale unravelled. The housekeeper admitted uncertainty, the clergyman confessed distraction, and the times, when compared, showed discrepancies too great to ignore. A flush mounted the nephew's cheek. His voice grew, strained as he sought to reconcile contradictions, but Holmes's relentless questioning left him ensnared by his own evasions. I could not fail to perceive that suspicion had now fastened itself firmly upon him, and that every eye in the room turned with growing mistrust to the man who, but days before, had been heir to his uncle's favour. Holmes turned next to Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, whose hands trembled visibly as he addressed her. "You, madam, have long been in charge of these chambers," he said quietly. "Tell us, did you never observe aught unusual in the candle set nightly at your master's bedside?" The woman's lips parted, and her eyes, wide with fear, darted from face to face. At last, she stammered that indeed she had noticed its altered look, the faint, greasy sheen upon the wax, the peculiar odour when it was first lit. "Yet I feared to speak," she confessed in a low voice, "for I thought it but my fancy, and my master was so insistent that no change be made. I held my tongue, lest I earn his displeasure." Holmes regarded her with grave courtesy. "You perceived, then, that something was amiss, but you lacked the courage to reveal it. That hesitation cost him dear, but it does not make you guilty of his murder." She sank into her chair with a sob, her secret torn into the light, and I saw in her countenance the strange mingling of relief and shame that comes of long suppressed fear. Holmes's gaze moved now to the Reverend Collier, who sat stiffly upright, his hands folded, his eyes attempting to convey serenity. "And you, sir," said Holmes, "have shown the most zealous interest in this household, in its wealth, in its future arrangements, matters which one might think lie outside a pastor's duty." The clergyman coloured deeply, murmuring of spiritual care and neighbourly concern. Holmes's voice, calm and precise, cut through his protest. "Yet you were present more often in the library than in the sick-room. You examined the accounts of the estate with a minuteness hardly required for the cure of souls. And you have spoken more than once of the disposal of property after death." A murmur ran through the room, and the clergyman, shifting in his seat, at last confessed that he had hoped to secure a generous bequest for parish works, and thus his interest had outrun propriety. Holmes inclined his head. "Your zeal, sir, was unseemly, but it stops short of crime. Others had motive more pressing, and opportunity more direct." With deliberate gravity, Holmes resumed his position before the hearth. His voice deepened, and I felt the whole company bend forward under its spell. "Let us then consider motive. Mr. Chesterton, as you all know, had announced his intention of distributing a portion of his estate upon Christmas Eve. That distribution, had it taken place, would have secured Eleanor Ward and certain charitable causes, leaving but a modest share for his nephew. By dying before the fair appointed hour and interstate, the entire inheritance would pass to one heir, unencumbered by such benevolence. The nephew started as though struck, and colour rushed to his cheeks. "It is here," continued Holmes, "that we perceive the desperate urgency, why death must forestall the season, why the candle must burn its victim away before the dawn of Christmas." The silence which followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire. The air itself seemed to grow heavy with the weight of unspoken realization, and I felt the cold logic of Holmes's words settle upon us all with terrible inevitability. Holmes's eyes, gleaming in the candlelight, fixed unerringly upon Charles Chesterton. "It was you, sir, who contrived this deed. You had access to your uncle's chamber under the pretext of dutiful attendance. You alone stood to gain by his sudden death, and you alone tampered with the candle, saturating it with a preparation whose vapour would sap life while leaving no mark upon the body. The broken latch upon the window, The irregular footprints, these were but your clumsy efforts to divert suspicion outward. But the snow told a truer tale, and the poisoned candle revealed the hand that set it. The nephew rose suddenly, his eyes blazing, but Holmes's voice, cool and inexorable, continued. Your motive was avarice, sharpened by resentment. Your uncle's promise to bestow his fortune elsewhere filled you with desperation. The time pressed, Christmas approached. Thus you chose this subtle method, trusting that death would pass for illness, and that the wealth of your house would fall into your grasp. The words fell like hammer blows, and the young man, for all his efforts at defiance, could not withstand them. His hands trembled, his lips moved, yet no words issued forth. At last the nephew's strength gave way. With a hoarse cry he sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Broken words escaped him, admissions of envy, of long-nurtured grievance, of temptation that had grown into resolve. Miss Eleanor sobbed softly, while the housekeeper crossed herself in terror. The clergyman rose in indignation, calling upon heaven to witness the enormity of the deed. Holmes, however, remained cold and grave. Justice must now take its course, said he. The law will weigh your confession, but your conscience has already passed its sentence. The culprit was secured under watch until the authorities might be summoned, his figure slumped in despair. The household, though relieved, was shaken to its core. No joy of the season could wholly dispel the horror of what had been revealed. As I walked beside Holmes to our chamber, I could not but reflect upon the irony that Christmas, which should bring peace and reconciliation, had in this house uncovered greed so ruthless that it stooped to murder. Holmes, perceiving my thoughts, remarked quietly, "It is ever thus, Watson. The shadow of avarice falls even upon the holiest days." Our departure from Chesterton House was marked by none of the cheer that usually accompanies the season. The carriage that bore us to the station passed slowly through lanes still muffled in snow, where the frost clung like silver to the hedgerows, and the smoke from cottages hung unmoving in the pale air. In the villages we traversed, children's voices could be heard singing carols at the doors, their laughter ringing with innocence. Yet to me, the sound seemed strangely discordant against the grim memory of death and disclosure that we carried with us. Holmes, his figure wrapped closely in his greatcoat, gazed fixedly from the window, unmoved by the rustic gaiety. At the small station, a handful of country folk bustled with sprigs of holly and parcels tied with twine, their faces ruddy from the cold. Yet, as we took our seats in the train, the festive atmosphere appeared to recede, leaving only the solemn recollection of that darkened house. I felt, as the wheels clattered upon the rails, that the frost-bound fields themselves bore witness to the corruption which had marred a season consecrated to peace. Holmes maintained a silence so profound during the journey that I scarcely dared interrupt him. His hands were folded upon his knees, his lean face composed but remote, as though his thoughts travelled in channels inaccessible to me. From time to time, I observed a flicker of the eyes, or the faint contraction of the brow, signs that some inward process of reflection was unfolding with relentless precision. The train thundered through cuttings banked with snow, past hamlets where bells rang cheerfully from steeples. Yet Holmes gave no sign of heeding them. I confess that the contrast between the outward merriment of England at her Christmastide and the sombre burden of our experience pressed heavily upon me. My companion's reticence, though not unusual after a case of peculiar intricacy, bore now an added weight, as if even his intellect, keen and untiring as it was, found little satisfaction in the result. I sat back in my corner, resigned to wait until he chose at last to unburden himself of the conclusions which, I knew well, must already be ordered in his mind. It was with no small relief that I found myself once more within the familiar confines of Baker Street. The lamps had been lit, the hearth glowed with cheerful flame, and Mrs. Hudson, with kindly foresight, had placed a modest evergreen upon the mantel. The clutter of Holmes's existence, the retorts, the monographs, the litter of papers and letters, lay about in their accustomed confusion, and never had I welcomed that disorder more gladly. To exchange the strained silence of Chesterton House for these familiar tokens was like passing from the shadow of death into the natural disorder of life. Holmes cast aside his coat, seated himself in his armchair, and stretched his long legs toward the fire. I, taking the opposite seat, felt a warmth steal into my very bones. Yet the memory of our recent experience clung about me, heavy and oppressive. The contrast between the snug chamber and the bleak corridors of the manor was so vivid that I could almost fancy I had dreamt it. Were it not for the sober figure across from me, whose face bore still the impress of stern thought. For some time we sat thus, Holmes staring into the flames with the abstracted gaze of one who reads meanings invisible to others. At length, I ventured to break the silence. "Holmes," said I, "this case has pressed heavily upon my mind. There is in it something peculiarly disheartening, that a season of goodwill should be perverted to such an end. What, then, is your reflection upon it?" He turned his eyes upon me, grave and thoughtful. "You are right, Watson," he replied, "that this affair carries with it a lesson beyond the mere mechanics of crime. It is not the candle, nor the poison, nor the clumsy footprints that linger in one's thoughts, but the motive which lay beneath. If the world is a great book of human passions, this page was written in the darkest ink." His words, spoken with calm gravity, seemed to gather the scattered impressions of the case into a single sombre truth. I leaned forward, eager to hear the fuller exposition, which I felt sure must follow. Holmes drew slowly upon his pipe before continuing, the smoke wreathing upward in pale spirals. "It is instructive, Watson," said he, "to note how often the crimes we encounter spring not from necessity but from greed. Avarice, that oldest of devils, will seize any instrument, the knife, the pen, or even a taper meant to cast light upon darkness. It matters not that the victim was kin, nor that the deed profaned the very threshold of Christmas. When men value wealth above duty, the season's sanctity becomes but another mask for crime. Observe how easily festive customs, designed to draw families closer, were here employed as a screen. The poisoned candle was but an emblem, a symbol of cheer corrupted into an agent of death. I find, in such cases, little satisfaction even in detection, for the spectacle of human weakness is too plain. His tone, though even, carried a note of austere indignation. I perceived that in his mind the triumph of reason had been overshadowed by the melancholy certainty of man's frailty. The fire burned low, the room settling into that half-light in which reflection seems most natural. Holmes, having relapsed into silence, at last leaned back, his profile outlined against the glow. "It is curious, Watson," he said at length, "how men will hang evergreens upon their walls and sing of peace, yet harbour in their hearts the same passions that thrive in midwinter as in midsummer. The calendar alters not the nature of man. If avarice can breathe through a candle flame, it can breathe through any season, be it sacred or profane." He smiled faintly, an expression half ironical, half weary. "Perhaps it is as well, my dear fellow, that Providence has left us the frost and the fire, the one to chill, the other to warm, lest we forget how narrow is the line between light and darkness." With that, he rose, stirring the embers into a brief blaze. I sat in silence, pondering his words, and as the shadows lengthened about the room, I felt that they were but the visible emblem of those moral shadows, which no Christmas light could wholly dispel. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the sharp profile of his face. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is no instrument of crime so subtle as human greed. It can cloak itself in custom, in piety, even in the warmth of Christmas candles. And yet its flame consumes all it touches." I made no reply, for his words needed none. "But I leave a question to you. What do you think was the murderer's gravest miscalculation? The poisoned candle itself, or the belief that no one would notice? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, remember to comment, subscribe, and share it with those who love a puzzle as much as Holmes himself.